I'm probably a little bit late to the party on this one, but today I want to talk about the Tier 8 Pan-Asian Cruiser Sejong. This is a tech tree ship, the pinnacle of the Pan-Asian line, and probably one of the best cruisers at Tier 8. I'll cover the specs of the ship, I'll show you the armor scheme in my commander build, talk about how it plays, usual ship breakdown, I suppose. Keep in mind, though, that all of the stats I'm about to read you are influenced by my commander choice. I'll put him up on the screen here. It's Chen, as you can see. He is a commander that is focused a lot on buffing the torpedoes of this ship, which are indeed quite the highlight. But let's get into the specs. To begin with, this ship has 32,000 HP, which is not a lot. I think there are some destroyers at this tier that approach that number. I'm looking at Elbing, for example. So, not a lot of playmaking currency, you might say, and the armor scheme doesn't necessarily do much to boost your confidence in the survivability of this vessel. It's got some highlights, though. On the one hand, we do have a 16mm bow and stern, as well as 16mm deck plating in some places. That value can even be overmatched by some heavy cruisers that you will encounter. Napoli, I think, would be one. I think also Henri, for example. Those could overmatch the 16mm plating with their AP. But crucially, the side plating is 32mm, which at least theoretically offers you some protection if you can angle that plating against even battleships with 18-inch guns, like Ohio or now Vermont. Those 457mm guns on those American battleships can overmatch 30mm plating, but not 32. So you can angle this plating against those vessels, not the Yamato or Musashi, of course. Those will simply go right through the plating and act like it doesn't exist because of overmatch mechanics. So you do have to be careful. Luckily, you have four charges of the Pan-Asian smokescreen if you use the fully packed skill. And the good thing about the Pan-Asian smokescreen, in my opinion, some of the best types of smoke in this game, is that this smokescreen consumable lasts for 70 seconds, and it reloads in 127 seconds. So that means by the time the smoke has completely cleared out, you're only waiting about a minute for your next charge to become available. So more or less, you can deploy this smoke continuously throughout the entire battle, and you never have to be unconcealed for too long. I think that's a nice feature of the smoke screen. It's almost like the slow motion of what you find on the British destroyers. That's the closest analogy I can really find to it. And of course, you can sit in that smoke screen and farm incoming ships with your guns and also your torpedoes, as our first torpedo hits the Alabama there. Let's talk about the torpedoes, actually, before we talk about the guns, because there's not much unexpected there. These are basically Atlanta guns. But the torpedoes, the Sejong has 16 deep water torpedoes, 8 on either side of the ship in 2 quad launchers. With this build, keep in mind this commander is focused on some torpedo characteristics like reload and I think damage and some other things. They reload in 117.5 seconds. They have a range of 13 kilometers and a speed of 67 knots. And because they are deep water torpedoes, they can only hit and damage cruisers, battleships, and CVs. They cannot hit or damage destroyers. But against those larger vessels, the maximum torpedo damage is 18,567, which is pretty comparable to the French torpedoes, which in terms of raw alpha, I think are second, generally speaking, to the IJN. So these are some pretty potent torpedoes, made even more potent by the fact that deep water torpedoes are stealthy. These have a torpedo detectability range by sea of 0.8 kilometers, which means unless you know they are coming, you are not going to be able to dodge them, because by the time they appear on your screen, they are less than a kilometer away from hitting your ship, and there's no possible way you could avoid them. So they are terrifying torpedoes, and they do a lot of damage. But of course, they're not necessarily the main armaments. We do have guns here. We have 12 127mm destroyer caliber guns, like what you find on the Tier 6 Atlanta. They've got a range with this build of 15.7 kilometers, which is not a lot. They reload in 5.3 seconds, so they're actually a little bit slower than the Atlanta. Maximum HE shell damage, 1,800, 11% fire chance, which is actually, I think, phenomenal for guns of this size that reload, I want to say this slowly, but over 5 seconds is slow for destroyer caliber guns reload. 11% fire chance, though. Fairly potent, I would say. And the maximum AP shell damage, 2,100. AA defenses, well, apparently they're pretty good. The thing's got an aggregate AA rating of 98, and it does have a maximum range on the AA guns of 5.2 kilometers for the dual-purpose 127mm main guns. Those guns also do an average DPS of 209, so theoretically, you'll be shooting down some planes if you are unfortunate enough to encounter the fun police as you patrol the seas in this light cruiser. Maneuverability characteristics are sort of middle of the road here. We've got a fairly pedestrian top speed of 33 knots. Certainly other cruisers at the tier are faster than that. Our turning circle, though, is very small at 670 millimeters, and the rudder shift is 7.7 seconds. You could, of course, buff that if you wanted to, and you could attempt to play this as an agile light cruiser, but why on earth would you do that when you have Pan-Asian smokescreens? And if you buff the concealment, you can achieve an excellent 9.4 kilometers by sea. That's what I have thanks to this build. So what is the Sejong? Well, it is a light cruiser with a smokescreen, and that means it's got mobile concealment that it can choose to deploy pretty much anywhere on the battlefield. It's also got floaty guns with not the best range. It's difficult to land these shells at long ranges, of course, because they take so long to reach the target. I mean, you can see here against this Akazuki, who's, 14, 15 kilometers away. It's going to take a full 13, almost 14 seconds for these shells to leave the gun barrels and actually reach the point on the map at which we are aiming. So that's a lot of time for things like small ships, Akazukis, other destroyers, to avoid that incoming fire. These shells are like the Atlantas, where when you fire them out of the guns, they go up, they orbit the Earth a couple times, and then they finally come down and hit their target. And the torpedoes, of course, they range out quite far at 13 kilometers. But I think the idea with this ship, if you take these floaty guns with the fairly fast reload, good HE spamming characteristics, the torpedoes, and the smokescreen, this all adds up to a ship which excels in impeding enemy pushes. And I suppose you could say the same things for light cruisers as a class. That's basically what they're designed to do. They pump out a lot of DPM, and they don't have a lot of armor, so oftentimes you'll find them playing behind islands where they can sort of hide and protect themselves from the enemy's return fire. And the goal is to find a place on the map where the enemy team is pushing in, light them up with the HE spam and the torpedoes, and, well, it's a lot more difficult to push. In fact, I would argue that the Sejong is one of the most toxic ships in this game to push into. Because we talked about the smokescreen thus far. I haven't mentioned that it has the repair party consumable, but it does have that. So if you do make some mistakes, like I did earlier on in this game, you can at least heal some of the HP back that you lose. But the highlight of this ship in terms of consumables is the one we just deployed right now, the torpedo reload booster. So Sejong has 8 torpedoes on either side of the ship, which means if you spin around, you can put 16 of them into the water at once. But if you decide that you want to pop the torpedo reload booster, well, then instead of 16 torpedoes, you can double that and put 32 of them in the water. There are 32 deep water torpedoes flying at the Bismarck and the Marco Polo inside of our cap circle. How many of them do you think are actually going to hit? Well, certainly not all 32, but a couple of them are going to hit. And I suppose if you are the Bismarck or you're the Marco Polo in this situation, or in a situation where you're just maybe pushing down one of the flanks on the Two Brothers map rather than pushing into the enemy base, and you see all these torpedoes coming at you, and maybe there's a smoke screen as well being deployed, and all of a sudden a bunch of HE spam starts flying from that smoke screen, well, maybe you don't feel as confident in your push anymore. These are the tools that are designed to stop a push. And when you can find a place on the map where the Sejong can sit inside of a smoke screen, launching these terrifying deep water torpedoes at enemy vessels and farming them down with repeated HE spam, well, you can rack up some torpedo hits, some floods, you can rack up some permanent fires, and you can do an awful lot of damage very quickly. It wasn't very long in this game before we broke 100K, and when we sort of started this engagement against the Bismarck and the Marco Polo, we were, I think, at 103,000 damage. We're all the way up to 145,000 now, and even though only 2 of our torpedoes hit the Bismarck out of the 32 that we launched, well, he's not doing very well, and we're going to be able to finish him off here with main guns, leaving only the Marco Polo and I believe the Akizuki still in our base. Smokescreen still online for a little bit longer. By the way, these torpedoes have such long range that if you've got a battleship 9 kilometers away from you, bow tanking, about to engage in the typical battleship strategy of reverse, well, a lot of times, if your torpedoes don't have this much range, you're probably not going to hit that battleship. But there's no way he's going to reverse 4 kilometers by the time these torpedoes reach him, so there is a good chance of making contact. And luckily, he's distracted with our teammates, so we can sort of farm him with impunity here, even though our smokescreen has run out. But of course, the Akizuki gets spotted, and he's the one that holds the majority of the cap points in our base. So obviously, we want to reset him and then sink him. You can see, though, that the dispersion is not necessarily pinpoint accurate, and the floaty shells are kind of difficult to aim at small maneuvering targets, even at relatively short ranges like that. But after a few tries, we are able to dial it in and take down the Akizuki. And then we get a torpedo hit on the Marco Polo, and that's pretty much the end of the game, with 171,000 damage done and 3 kills. And Sejong is not always going to work out like this, of course. The idea is you need ships to be pushing into you in order to deal this incredible amount of damage with all the tools that you have available to you. Of course, if ships are running away, well, then the Sejong becomes a little bit less great. But it's fantastic if you can hold down a flank and stop the enemy from pushing it. You've got all the tools to do it with this cruiser, and I highly recommend grinding it. Even the Harbin at Tier 7 and the other cruisers in the line for the Pan-Asian tree are fairly good. This is certainly the pinnacle. I very much enjoy playing it, and I'm kind of sorry I haven't played it extensively before now. But I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.